The earth was cool and yielding beneath Aggie's calloused fingers. Tomato seedlings, tiny green sentinels, stood bravely in their peat pots, awaiting transfer to the raised beds. Gruff, his beard speckled with dew, chewed contentedly on a stray dandelion, his amber eyes half closed in the morning sun. He nudged her hand with his velvety nose, a silent offering of companionship. All right, you overgrown vacuum cleaner," Aggie muttered, scratching behind his ears. "Just don't eat the petunias, okay? Mrs. Abernathy next door already glares at me enough as it is." Harmony Glens wasn't exactly built for goats. Rows of identical houses, each sporting a perfectly manicured lawn and a two-car garage, stretched into the distance like a suburban army. The air hung thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint hum of automatic sprinklers. It was a place of order, of quiet conformity, a place where a well-placed gnome was considered daring. And then there was Aggie, and then there was Gruff. She eased herself up, her knees protesting with a familiar creak. Gruff immediately mirrored her movement, his hooves clicking softly on the flagstone path. He was her shadow, her furry, four-legged anchor. The days in Harmony Glens settled into a rhythm. Aggie woke early, the nightmares less frequent now, thanks to Gruff's constant presence. He'd often be asleep at the foot of her bed, his warm, earthy scent a comforting balm against the lingering fear. She'd make coffee, strong and black, and sit on the porch swing, Gruff nestled beside her, watching the sunrise paint the identical houses in hues of pink and gold. Afternoons were spent in the garden, weeding, pruning, and coaxing life from the soil. Gruff would patrol the perimeter, occasionally chasing butterflies or engaging in a philosophical debate with the neighborhood squirrels. Sometimes the sudden, unexpected noises, a car backfiring, a child screaming, would still send a jolt of adrenaline through her. But now there was Gruff, a gentle nudge, a warm body pressed against her leg, a grounding presence that pulled her back from the edge. Evenings were quiet, a simple meal, a book, and the comforting sound of Gruff chewing his cud. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of Mrs. Abernathy peeking through her curtains, her face a mask of disapproval. Aggie would simply smile and wave, a small act of defiance in a world that seemed determined to box her in. One Tuesday, Aggie was attempting to wrangle a rogue rose bush when a golf cart, gleaming white and adorned with the Harmony Glens HOA logo, trundled up her driveway. Mildred McMillan, the HOA president and reigning queen of floral arrangements, stepped out, her lips pursed into a permanent frown. "Agnes," she began, her voice dripping with practiced condescension. "We need to talk about the animal." Aggie straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Gruff, sensing the change in atmosphere, stepped protectively in front of her. "Gruff's not bothering anyone, Mildred," Aggie said, her voice steady. "He keeps the grass trimmed and he's quieter than your yappy poodle." Mildred's frown deepened. "That's not the point, Agnes. The bylaws clearly state that only domestic animals, cats and dogs specifically, are permitted within Harmony Glens. A goat is simply not in keeping with the aesthetic." "He's a certified emotional support animal," Aggie countered, her voice hardening. "He's prescribed by my therapist." Mildred waved a dismissive hand. "I'm sure he's very therapeutic, but the rules are the rules, Agnes. We've received complaints, people are concerned. The board has decided that Gruff must go." Aggie felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. The peace she had so carefully cultivated was threatened. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her vulnerability began to crumble. "And if he doesn't?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Mildred adjusted her perfectly coiffed hair. "Then we'll be forced to issue daily fines, Agnes. We wouldn't want that, would we?" As Mildred drove away, leaving a trail of manufactured floral scent in her wake, Aggie looked down at Gruff. He gazed back at her, his amber eyes filled with an unnerving intelligence. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was more than just a disagreement about a goat. This was a battle for her right to exist, to heal, to find peace in a world that seemed determined to deny it to her. And she wasn't about to back down, not this time, not ever. Sunlight flashed from the gleaming chrome of Mrs. Higgins' Lexus, purring across the pavement. Agnes, tending her petunias, recognized the sedan and its driver. The silver-helmeted head of Mrs. Higgins pivoted, her scrutiny lingering on Agnes' painstakingly neat flower beds. Agnes released a weary breath. The woman's attention felt like a heavy cloak. Ignoring the unwelcome gaze, Agnes savored the silken touch of the petals and the rich perfume of the earth. Gruff, ever watchful, pricked his ears, his amber gaze locked on the Lexus. A soft, questioning ma escaped him. "Just Higgins being Higgins, love," Agnes murmured, scratching the base of his horns. "Pay her no mind." Later, as long afternoon shadows stretched, a sharp knock reverberated on Agnes' door. Young Timothy, Mrs. Higgins' grandson, stood with shoulders slumped, clutching a formal envelope. "Sorry, Ms. Kowalski," he mumbled, eyes fixed on his shoes. Agnes accepted the missive. The HOA emblem, a pristine tableau of manicured lawns, felt like a direct jab. She thanked the boy, who all but sprinted back to his grandmother's waiting vehicle. The letter within was coldly typed. The heading, Notice of Violation. A knot formed in Agnes' stomach. She slumped into her favorite armchair, Gruff nestled at her side, his warm, goaty aroma a small solace. She quickly parsed the initial paragraph, a thicket of legalistic phrasing concerning community standards and property guidelines. Then she hit the core issue. "It has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that you are in violation of Article 7, Section 2, Subsection B, regarding acceptable domesticated animals within the community. Specifically, the presence of a caprine asterisk, individual at your residence, is deemed to be in direct conflict with these regulations. The aforementioned asterisk caprine presents a potential hazard to property values and the overall suburban serenity of our esteemed neighborhood." Agnes repeated the word caprine, a humorless laugh bubbling up. They couldn't even bring themselves to say goat. She continued, a flush creeping up her neck. "Furthermore, this unauthorized animal is considered a disturbance due to its potential for excessive noise and its tendency to attract unwanted attention. Therefore, the Homeowners Association demands the immediate removal of the aforementioned asterisk caprine from your property. Noncompliance within 7 days will result in a daily penalty of $100, escalating to $500 after 30 days. Agnes crushed the letter in her fist. $100 a day, a blatant attempt to bankrupt her. Gruff nudged her hand with his soft muzzle, emitting a low, anxious rumble. He seemed to register her mounting fury. She smoothed the document on her lap, searching the fine print for an escape clause, some glimmer of justification. There was none, only frigid, bureaucratic pronouncements. The phrase suburban serenity resonated in her mind, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had previously defined her existence. She carved out a pocket of tranquility here in her humble abode with her garden and her goat. Now that fragile peace was under attack. She gazed at Gruff, his kind eyes reflecting her worry. He represented far more than just an animal. He was her linchpin, her silent confidant, the one who steered her away from the darkness. His presence had been prescribed for a valid reason. "They just don't get it, do they, boy?" she whispered, her voice wavering slightly. "They understand nothing." She rose, her spine stiffening. The letter, a symbol of this brewing conflict, lay forgotten on the armchair. This extended beyond a goat. This was about her right to simply be, to recuperate, to discover a small sliver of the planet where she could finally find belonging. And Agnes Kowalski had no intention of surrendering without a fight. The echoes of congressional testimony, her own voice amplified in support of veterans, surged within her. This time it wasn't exclusively for them, it was for herself, and without question for Gruff. Agnes squared her shoulders, the crisp morning air doing little to soothe the knot in her stomach. The packet in her hand felt substantial, a shield of laminated documents against the coming storm. She spent the better part of yesterday compiling everything, from Gruff's certification as an emotional support animal to excerpts from the Americans with Disabilities Act. She hoped it would be enough. The wrought iron gate of the HOA president's house creaked open under her touch, the sound echoing the grinding gears of her anxiety. Mrs. Higgins' manicured lawn was a testament to order, each blade of grass standing rigidly at attention, a stark contrast to the unruly joy Gruff brought to her own small patch of earth. Mrs. Higgins opened the door before Agnes could even knock, her face a study in disapproval. "Ms. Kowalski, I trust you received our notification." The woman's voice was as starched as her floral blouse. "Yes, ma'am, that's why I'm here. I brought documentation regarding Gruff," Agnes said, holding out the packet. Mrs. Higgins took it with a delicate sniff, as if it carried a contagious disease. She retreated into the perfectly appointed living room, gesturing for Agnes to follow. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, the only visible imperfection. "I appreciate your effort, Ms. Kowalski," Mrs. Higgins said, placing the packet on a mahogany table. "But frankly, I don't see how any amount of paperwork can alter the fact that you are keeping a farm animal in a residential community governed by a very specific set of bylaws." She picked up the top sheet, a picture of Gruff sporting a goofy grin, and wrinkled her nose. "Goats simply aren't permitted. It's in Section 3.2, Subsection B, Paragraph 7, No livestock, poultry, or exotic animals shall be kept or maintained on any property. She recited the words as if they were holy scripture. Agnes took a deep breath. Mrs. Higgins, Gruff isn't a farm animal in the traditional sense. He's a certified emotional support animal. He helps manage my PTSD. The ADA, along with the Fair Housing Act, protect my right to have him, even with a no-pets policy. She pointed to the packet. All the documentation is there, including the letters from my therapist and Gruff's registration. Mrs. Higgins flipped through the pages, her lips pursed. Registration. I'll need to verify the legitimacy of this registration. And even if it's all perfectly legitimate, Ms. Kowalski, it doesn't supersede our community standards. The tranquility, the property values, these are paramount. Tranquility, Agnes's voice rose a notch. Is tranquility worth more than a veteran's mental health? Are property values more important than my right to live a normal life after serving my country? She gestured around the sterile room. This isn't tranquility, Mrs. Higgins, it's a museum, a prison of perfect lawns and silent suffering. Mrs. Higgins' eyes narrowed. That's quite enough, Ms. Kowalski. I understand you've been through things, but that doesn't give you the right to disregard the rules. We have a system in place for a reason. If we make exceptions for everyone with a sob story, where does it end? A sob story? Agnes repeated, her voice trembling. This isn't a sob story, Mrs. Higgins. This is about my life, my well-being. Gruff isn't some frivolous pet. He's my lifeline. And it's not about making exceptions. It's about following the law, about respecting the rights of people with disabilities. The law is open to interpretation, Ms. Kowalski, and the HOA bylaws are very clear. Mrs. Higgins crossed her arms, a granite wall of resistance. You have 48 hours to remove the goat, otherwise the daily fines will commence. She walked to the door and opened it, a silent dismissal. Good day, Ms. Kowalski. Agnes stood for a moment, stunned. The air in the pristine hallway felt thick, suffocating. You haven't even looked at the documentation, she stated, almost a whisper. Mrs. Higgins smiled, a brittle, joyless expression. I've seen enough. Agnes turned and walked out, the click of the gate latch echoing her rising fury. The packet in her hand felt heavier now, no longer a shield, but a useless weight. As she walked towards home, she could almost hear Gruff's gentle bleating, a sound of comfort and defiance that fueled the fire in her belly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sand, a stinging exfoliant under the helicopter's brutal downdraft, assaulted Agnes's face. The Chinook bucked like a bronco, slamming her into her seat's webbing. The Afghan terrain spun below, a muted canvas of umber and stone. Rifle clutched tight, knuckles bone-white, she tasted the metallic edge of apprehension. The air hung thick with dust and exhaust fumes. Then Oblivion roared, RPG. The thought hammered through the chaos. The lead Humvee disintegrated in a ferocious blast, a blossoming inferno of twisted metal. Screams sliced through the air, a chorus of raw fear and adrenaline. They spilled from the Chinook's belly, hitting the harsh ground at a sprint, weapons raised, eyes darting, seeking any telltale sign of the enemy. She registered the oppressive heat, a tangible weight, the bitter reek of burning synthetics and explosives. A cacophony of desperate cries, human and animal, blended into a horrifying aria. A young private, his face still holding the soft curves of boyhood, locked eyes with her, his expression a tableau of pure terror as he wrestled with his weapon. Agnes's shout, a clipped directive, vanished in the bedlam. Then the crack. A sound like tearing silk preceded the sickening thud of impact. Not the private, someone beyond him. No time to see who. The sniper had to be silenced. Her finger tightened, the rifle a snarling extension of her arm, spitting rounds towards the suspected hide. Suppression. A desperate gamble. They crawled forward, each inch bought with agonizing effort, her world narrowing to the tunnel vision of her scope, the drumbeat of her pulse, the ragged rasp of her breath. A glint. A shadow separating from the dun-colored mud of a crumbling wall. No hesitation, trigger pull decisive. The figure collapsed, just gone. The abrupt cessation of being haunted her more than any imagined triumph. A void etched in sand. That void hitched a ride home. Sleep devolved into a war zone. Nocturnal horrors ambushed her, dragging her back to the incinerating landscape, the echoing screams, the fallen. She would bolt upright, gasping, slick with cold sweat, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest, convinced the nightmare was real. Daylight offered no sanctuary. Anxiety coiled tight, a venomous serpent in her gut. Crowds morphed into potential threats, every unexpected sound a landmine waiting to detonate. Her senses were perpetually maxed out, her body a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. The everyday felt precarious, untrustworthy. Therapy proved fruitless, medication dulled but didn't heal. The diagnosis, PTSD, the prognosis, normal, but normalcy felt like a fairy tale. A mundane Tuesday rain streaking the windows brought deliverance in the form of official documents. Adoption papers, hope rekindled after near extinction. The shelter had issued warnings. Gruff was unique. A massive, amiable Nubian goat with an appetite for footwear and an uncanny knack for reading her emotional weather. He awaited her, a goofy grin splitting his whiskered face, his pendulous ears flapping wildly as he lumbered toward her. She knelt, hesitant, unsure. He nudged her hand with his damp nose, his gaze clear and unwavering. Something gave way inside. She led him home. That night the demons returned, claws extended. The familiar terror threatened to drown her. But a subtle pressure against her leg pulled her back from the abyss. Warmth, a soft, insistent bleat. Gruff. He stood sentinel by her bedside, his dark eyes locked on hers. Another gentle nudge, then he settled beside the bed, his sturdy body pressed against her arm. She reached out, her hand trembling, and buried her fingers in his thick fleece. His presence a balm, a steady, reassuring anchor in the roiling tempest of her mind. The nightmares persisted. The anxiety lingered, a shadow clinging to the edges of her vision. But no longer was she alone in the dark. Gruff remained, a silent, steadfast guardian, a furry reminder that even amidst the worst storms, warmth, solace, and the possibility of peace still existed. Not a cure, but a lifeline, a reason to persevere, a reason to breathe. Agnes wrestled with the phone like it was an IED, its smooth surface suddenly slippery in her grasp. It had been years since she'd spoken to Colonel Davies, not since the medal ceremony in D.C. where the forced pleasantries had tasted like ash in her mouth. But Gruff's bleeding seemed to echo her own silent plea. She punched in the number, her thumb a blur of anxiety. "Davies," a voice barked, still sharp enough to slice through steel. Agnes swallowed. "Colonel, this is Agnes Kowalski. I served under you in." "Well, you remember." A beat of silence. "Kowalski, Aggie Kowalski. By God, I thought you disappeared off the face of the earth. What can I do for you, soldier?" Agnes explained, the story tumbling out, a jumbled mess of HOA regulations, bureaucratic indifference, and the profound comfort Gruff brought her. She finished, her voice tight. "They want me to get rid of him, Colonel. They don't understand. He's the only thing that keeps the nightmares quiet." Davies listened without interruption, his initial gruffness softening with each sentence. When she finished, he sighed, a sound that spoke volumes about the battles he'd fought both on and off the field. "Damn it, Aggie, this is exactly the kind of crap we fight against. Give me the details. We'll get the boys at Vets for justice on it. This reeks of discrimination." That was Tuesday. By Friday, the internet was ablaze. It started with a single post on the Vets for Justice Facebook page, a picture of Agnes, her face etched with worry, standing beside Gruff, his amber eyes gleaming with what Agnes could only interpret as stoic support. The caption read, "Agnes Kowalski served her country with honor. Now her HOA is trying to take away the one thing that helps her cope with PTSD, her emotional support animal, Gruff." This isn't just about a goat, it's about honoring our veterans and their rights. Goat justice for Agnes. Within hours, #Goat Justice for Agnes was trending. A local news station picked up the story, running a segment featuring Agnes and Gruff. Agnes, initially hesitant, found herself speaking with a passion she hadn't realized she possessed. She talked about the nightmares, the crippling anxiety, the feeling of being perpetually on edge. She explained how Gruff, with his goofy antics and unwavering presence, grounded her, reminded her that there was still joy to be found in the world. The comments section exploded. "This is outrageous," one user wrote. "That HOA should be ashamed of themselves." Another shared their own story of struggling with PTSD and the vital role their service dog played in their recovery. Offers of legal assistance poured in. A goat sanctuary in a neighboring state even offered to provide Gruff with a lifelong home, although Agnes quickly and firmly declined. The HOA's Facebook page was flooded with angry messages, review bombing their business with one-star ratings. The online vitriol intensified, with some even discovering the personal social media accounts of the board members and sending hateful messages. Within days, national news outlets were calling. Suddenly, Agnes and Gruff were everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Agnes found herself thrust into the spotlight, a reluctant spokesperson for veterans' rights and the importance of emotional support animals. She handled the interviews with surprising grace, her dry wit and unwavering conviction winning over even the most skeptical reporters. One article in the Washington Post * featured a photograph of Agnes testifying before Congress years ago, advocating for changes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The headline read, "The Goat Ladies Crusade: How a Veteran's Fight for Her ESA Could Change the Law." Agnes barely had time to process the whirlwind of attention. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews, lawyers wanted to offer their services, and complete strangers wanted to send her words of encouragement and, bizarrely, goat-themed gifts. She found herself overwhelmed but also strangely energized. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was fighting for something bigger than herself. And Gruff, oblivious to the media frenzy, continued to munch on dandelions in the backyard, a furry, four-legged symbol of hope and resilience. The conference room carried a faint aroma of lemon cleaner and a heavier scent of desperation. Across the polished table sat Agnes, facing Sarah Chen and Maria Rodriguez, both radiating competence from the Disability Rights Legal Center. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, illuminating drifting particles, a fragile dance against the backdrop of weighty legal matters. "Mrs. Kowalski," Sarah began, her tone a soothing balm, "reiterate for us, if you would, the sequence of events." Agnes inhaled deeply, the worn leather of her bomber jacket whispering with the movement. "They want Gruff banished. They call him a goat. He's my anchor." She detailed the burgeoning conflict with the HOA, the mounting fines, the increasing animosity radiating from Mrs. Higgins. She spoke of Gruff's calming effect, the gentle nudge against her palm when nightmares clawed at her sleep, the quiet solace he provided when the silence in the house threatened to swallow her whole. Maria leaned forward, her gaze intent. "Do you possess documentation substantiating your PTSD diagnosis and Gruff's status as an emotional support animal?" Agnes nodded, sliding a hefty file across the gleaming surface. "Everything's there. Doctors' assessments, official certifications, even a transcript of congressional testimony from years prior." Sarah scanned the papers. Substantial, a compelling case, Mrs. Kowalski, quite compelling. She exchanged a significant look with Maria. "We're prepared to offer our services pro bono. We see this as a critical battle, not only for you but for other veterans and people with disabilities who depend on these animals for essential support." A wave of relief surged through Agnes, so intense it almost destabilized her. "Thank you," she choked out, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. I don't know what I'd have done otherwise." Elsewhere across the city, Priscilla Higgins occupied the opulent office of Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer whose reputation for pitilessness was eclipsed only by his exorbitant fees. The air hung thick with the ghosts of old money and expensive cigars. "This is utterly insufferable, Mr. Abernathy," Priscilla announced, adjusting her strand of pearls. "This Kowalski woman is turning our community into a laughingstock, a goat. It's unhygienic, it's an eyesore, and it establishes a dreadful precedent." Abernathy, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched in tanned leather, tented his fingers. "The woman asserts it's an emotional support animal." "Absurd, it's an ungulate. I personally witnessed it devouring my prize-winning roses. And the stench, it's appalling. She's manipulating the system, exploiting her veteran status. We must halt this, Mr. Abernathy. We must safeguard the sanctity of Meadow Creek Estates." Abernathy offered a measured nod. "Consider it resolved, Mrs. Higgins. We will craft a vivid portrayal of the disturbance this beast creates. We will underscore the Kowalski woman's blatant disregard for communal norms. We shall transform this, Caprine, into an emblem of societal breakdown." The following dawn, Agnes was jolted awake by a clamor, not the familiar chorus of birds but the relentless hum of news trucks. Peeking through the blinds, she caught her breath. Her yard had become a stage for cameras, reporters, and rubbernecking neighbors. A banner, flapping haphazardly on her mailbox, proclaimed, "Save Gruff." The lawsuit had been launched. As Agnes stood on her porch, Gruff bleating softly beside her, a reporter thrust a microphone close. "Mrs. Kowalski, what is your response to the HOA's claims that Gruff constitutes a public nuisance?" Before Agnes could formulate a reply, Mrs. Higgins materialized from her meticulously landscaped lawn across the street, a cohort of HOA members forming a protective barrier. She advanced, her voice amplified by a conveniently placed bullhorn. "This is not about denying anyone their entitlements. This is about upholding shared standards. That goat is a disturbance, it's a health risk, it imperils our property values." She paused for dramatic emphasis. "We will not be intimidated by a single individual who refuses to adhere to regulations." The cameras pivoted, capturing the escalating confrontation. The battle lines were now firmly drawn. The media circus had officially commenced. Agnes tightened her grip on Gruff's leash, the goat's soft coat a small island of comfort in the gathering storm. This had ballooned into something far greater than she ever anticipated. The community hall buzzed like a disturbed hive. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as residents crammed in, their faces a mixture of outrage, curiosity, and morbid glee. Agnes stood at the back, Gruff tethered calmly beside her, his amber eyes taking in the scene with an unnerving intelligence. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations. Priscilla Higgins, perched on the edge of the stage like a queen surveying her conquered lands, rapped a gavel with unnecessary force. Order. We need order, her voice, amplified by the microphone, sliced through the rising din. The agenda was simple, the continued presence of a goat at 14 Oak Street. The debate, however, was anything but. Accusations flew faster than badminton birdies at the summer picnic. Concerns about property values mingled with cries of "it's just a goat," and "think of the children." Agnes watched, her jaw tight. She'd anticipated this, but the sheer venom directed her way felt like a physical blow. A woman with meticulously coiffed blonde hair pointed a finger. That asterisk thing is a nuisance. I can smell it from my living room." Agnes bit back a retort about the woman's questionable perfume choices. This wasn't the time for sarcasm, not if she wanted to win. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of bickering, Mrs. Higgins called on Agnes to speak. Agnes took a deep breath, the scent of Gruff's earthy wool grounding her. She walked to the front, the click of her boots echoing in the sudden silence. She hadn't prepared a speech. She didn't need one, she had the truth. "My name is Agnes Kowalski, and yes, Gruff is my goat," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He's also a certified emotional support animal. I understand that a goat living in suburbia is unconventional." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the room. "But Gruff isn't a pet, he's my lifeline." She paused, forcing herself to meet the gazes of the people in front of her. Faces she'd seen at block parties, holiday gatherings, the occasional awkward elevator ride. Now they were masks of judgment. "I served in Afghanistan," she continued, the words raw, unpolished. "I came back different. I won't bore you with the details, but let's just say that sudden noises, crowds, even the smell of gasoline can send me spiraling." She clenched her fist, the phantom weight of her rifle pressing into her palm. "Gruff senses those triggers, he calms me, he grounds me, he keeps me from," she faltered, unable to voice the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. A murmur went through the crowd, a few faces softened. "You talk about property values," Agnes said, her voice gaining strength. "But what about human value? What about the value of a veteran trying to rebuild her life, to find a semblance of peace after serving this country?" She swept her gaze across the room. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for understanding, for compassion." She finished, the silence hanging heavy in the air. Then a voice, hesitant but clear, broke through. "My son, he came back from Iraq different too," a man near the back of the room said quietly. Maybe we're being too quick to judge." Another voice joined in, then another. A slow tide of support began to swell. Mrs. Higgins' face was a mask of fury. She banged the gavel again. "Enough, this is getting out of hand. We have bylaws to uphold." Just then a young woman stood up holding a tablet. "Mrs. Higgins," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think everyone should see this." She projected an email onto the large screen behind the stage. It was from Mrs. Higgins, sent several weeks prior to a local real estate agent. "I'm willing to offer a substantial bonus if you can find a way to get rid of the eyesore at 14 Oak Street. The veteran. She's bad for property values, and frankly, I can't stand her." A collective gasp filled the room. The email went on, detailing a plan to subtly undermine Agnes's reputation, to make her life in the community unbearable. The room was dead silent. Mrs. Higgins stared at the screen, her face draining of color. Agnes felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The truth, like a stubborn weed, had finally pushed through the carefully cultivated soil of prejudice. It was just a start, she knew, but it was a start. Gruff nudged her hand with his velvety nose. Agnes stroked his head, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like she had a fighting chance. "Gentlemen, ladies," Mr. Abernathy, the HOA's lawyer, adjusted his tie, the overhead fluorescent lights of the conference room reflecting harshly off his bald head. "We've reviewed the Kowalski case again, and well, the situation has become significantly more precarious." Priscilla Higgins, usually radiating an almost unbearable level of manicured perfection, looked wan. Her lipstick was a shade too bright against her pale skin, and the usually sharp lines of her tailored suit seemed to droop. She hadn't slept well. Preposterous. We have bylaws. She has a asterisk goat. Abernathy sighed, a sound like air leaking from a tire. The bylaws are less effective when confronted with federal disability law, Mrs. Higgins, and the media attention, it's unhelpful. The online petitions, the veterans' groups, they're painting us as heartless bullies victimizing a disabled veteran. He cleared his throat. Moreover, the discovery phase has revealed some unfortunate internal communications. He pointed to a redacted document on the table, careful not to meet Priscilla's eye. Another board member, a stout man named Mr. Davison, frowned. What kind of communications? Emails mostly, discussing strategies for circumventing potential ADA claims, phrases like exploiting loopholes and species allowance override, not exactly flattering, gentlemen, ladies. He tapped the document again. The optics are terrible. Priscilla finally spoke, her voice tight. So, what are you suggesting, Mr. Abernathy? We simply surrender, allow this menagerie to overrun our community. Surrender isn't the word I'd use, Abernathy said smoothly. I'd prefer strategic resolution. A settlement. We offer Miss Kowalski a formal apology, revise the pet policy to be more inclusive of emotional support animals, and perhaps a modest financial compensation for her legal expenses and the inconvenience. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Davison sputtered, "Financial compensation? Are you mad?" Abernathy held up a hand. Consider the alternative. A lengthy, costly court battle, the very real possibility of losing, and the continued negative publicity. This settlement allows us to control the narrative, mitigate the damage, and avoid setting a precedent that could invite further challenges to our authority. In fact, we can actually spin this as a victory, that the HOA is sympathetic to the needs of our residents, that we are reasonable and adaptive. Priscilla looked defeated. The fight had drained the color from her, leaving her a faded imitation of her former self. The thought of admitting defeat, of apologizing to Agnes Kowalski, burned like acid in her throat, but she saw the worried faces of the other board members, the growing apprehension in their eyes. The headlines were already damaging property values. She could almost hear the whispers, the accusations of prejudice. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, the steely glint that had once been so menacing now just tired. "Fine," she said, her voice barely audible. "Do it, settle." The next day, Agnes found a crisp white envelope tucked beneath the doormat. No return address. She picked it up cautiously, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept in her pocket. Old habits died hard. Inside was a letter, formally worded on heavy embossed paper. It was from the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association, offering a settlement to resolve the dispute regarding her emotional support animal. Agnes scanned the document, her eyebrows rising with each paragraph. The HOA, represented by their legal counsel, formally apologized for any distress caused by their initial actions. They acknowledged the validity of Beatrice's status as an emotional support animal. They committed to revising the pet policy to explicitly include provisions for ESAs, ensuring that future residents would not face similar challenges. And yes, there was a check attached, covering her legal fees and a sum that she suspected was meant to quietly compensate her for the emotional toll. But it was the final paragraph that caught her attention. A carefully worded statement expressing the HOA's sincere regret for any perceived insensitivity and their commitment to fostering a welcoming and inclusive community for all residents, including veterans and individuals with disabilities. Agnes reread it slowly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. It wasn't everything she'd hoped for, but it was a start, a crack in the wall, an olive branch extended, however, reluctantly. She glanced out the window at Beatrice, contentedly munching on clover in the yard. The goat looked up, bleating softly, as if sensing her thoughts. Agnes took a deep breath, the tension she had been holding for weeks slowly beginning to dissipate. The battle wasn't over, not entirely, but for now at least there was peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something resembling harmony. Aggie signed the settlement agreement with a hand that trembled only slightly. Priscilla Higgins, her face a mask of carefully controlled displeasure, barely made eye contact. The sum was substantial enough to secure Aggie's future and, more importantly, Gruff's. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with the lingering bitterness of the fight. As Priscilla swept out, heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the polished floor, Aggie whispered to Gruff, "We'll show them what tranquility really means, won't we, boy?" Her first act was to purchase the vacant lot at the edge of the development, a patch of overgrown weeds and discarded tires that the HOA had deemed unsuitable for development. It was perfect. She envisioned rows of raised beds bursting with color, the scent of herbs mingling with the sweet perfume of blooming honeysuckle. She would name it Gruff's Garden, a place where everyone, regardless of age or ability, could find solace and connection with the earth. The work was arduous. Aggie, her hands calloused and aching, spent weeks clearing debris, tilling the stubborn soil, and constructing the raised beds. She enlisted the help of local volunteers, many of whom had followed her story with Gruff and admired her tenacity. Soon, the lot transformed from a neglected eyesore into a vibrant oasis. Children planted sunflowers that towered over their heads, the elderly tended to rows of fragrant lavender, and veterans found a therapeutic escape among the rows of vegetables. Gruff, of course, was the garden's unofficial mascot. He roamed freely, nibbling on stray weeds and accepting pats from delighted visitors. He seemed to understand the garden's purpose, his gentle presence a calming influence on everyone who entered. Word of Gruff's gentle nature spread beyond the confines of the development. Soon, Aggie was receiving requests from schools and hospitals asking if Gruff could visit. At first, she hesitated, wary of exposing him to unfamiliar environments. But seeing the joy he brought to the children at the local elementary school, their faces lighting up as he nudged their hands with his soft nose, she knew she couldn't refuse. Gruff became a furry ambassador of hope, visiting patients at the Veterans Hospital, his presence a quiet comfort to those struggling with physical and emotional wounds. He listened patiently as they recounted their stories, offering a non-judgmental ear and a warm, fuzzy body to lean against. He seemed to possess an innate understanding of their pain, his gentle bleating a soothing balm to their troubled souls. As Independence Day approached, the town council contacted Aggie with an unexpected request. They wanted her and Gruff to lead the annual parade. Initially, she demurred, uncomfortable with the idea of being the center of attention. But then she realized it wasn't about her. It was about Gruff, about the community she had helped build, and about the spirit of resilience that they had all embraced. On the morning of the parade, Aggie felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. She smoothed down her simple cotton dress and adjusted the small American flag she had attached to Gruff's collar. He stood patiently beside her, his eyes calm and steady, as if sensing her nervousness. As they stepped onto Main Street, a roar of applause erupted from the crowd. Banners waved, children cheered, and the local marching band struck up a patriotic tune. Aggie, her heart swelling with pride, walked alongside Gruff, acknowledging the cheers with a shy smile. Priscilla Higgins stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but as Gruff passed by, he paused, turning his head to look directly at her. He let out a soft bleat, a sound that seemed to hold a mixture of forgiveness and understanding. For a fleeting moment, Priscilla's stern facade faltered, replaced by a flicker of something akin to regret. Then she quickly regained her composure and turned away. As Aggie and Gruff led the parade through the town, she realized that their victory wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a community where everyone, even a goat, could find a place to belong. The tranquility she had sought wasn't the sterile, enforced silence the HOA had envisioned. It was the vibrant, joyful harmony of a community united by compassion and resilience, a symphony of laughter, shared labor, and the gentle bleating of a very special goat. The sun warmed her face, the cheers of the crowd filled her ears, and for the first time in a long time, Agnes Kowalski felt truly at peace.